property is literally a game of finance. Like the whole reason I like property as a vehicle is people will come give me 100% loan with my equity. I don't have to use any of my money and I can keep kind of going. So I actually don't even care about property. I just like that the banks will lend me big sums of money so I can make big sums of money. You can also lose it if you don't know what you're doing. So I don't want to sugarcoat it. But why would you not speak to a broker? Like they don't charge anything. They get paid by the bank. You've on quite a few occasions actually told the person to stay with the current bank. You're like, no, if that makes sense, stick with them. And then that's fine. That's good, reputable advice.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Education Pod, hosted by Nick at the Lending Lab. Today we're interviewing Steve Palise from Palise Property. How are you, Steve?
Thanks for having me on, man. I'm really good. How about you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, mate. I'm good. I'm really excited to chat to you today. I think it's going to be a great podcast. I'm always getting the questions. We want to learn more about commercial property. How do we get started? And what are the steps? Because, you know, it is a tricky game. So it'd be really good if we could kind of talk through that today and kind of engage our viewers.
Yeah, I always point out it's not tricky. There's just a lot of steps you have to do. It's like residential's like walking down 3 steps in like a staircase, and commercial you got to do 20 steps. So there's more places you can fall and hurt yourself, but it's not hard. It's just you just got to go through it. There's a lot more grunt work, whereas residential people, they just want to go on realestate.com and go, oh, that's a nice pretty house and buy it.
Yeah.
Commercial's not about that. It's all numbers, all data, which we'll go into today.
Yeah, fantastic. And I've got to love the numbers. It's the best part for sure.
Me being an ex-structural engineer, no emotion. It is literally data, comparables, make the decision like it's a business decision, which is nice.
So for our listeners that aren't familiar with yourself and Palise Property, do you want to give me like a really quick elevator pitch of what you do?
All right. So I used to be a structural engineer, but then built my own portfolio. I think I had 8 or 9 properties before I became a full-time buyer's agent. And then since then, basically, I just represent the buyer. So I don't do like principal place of residence holding hands through. I just go out and find good investment opportunities. So find just commercials that good fundamentals, good tenant, long lease, low vacancy rate, versatile premises, just really good. And we do the whole process. So find the deal, negotiate it, do all the due diligence, and we'll go into that. There's like an 80-page due diligence, help them with conveyancing, building pest inspections, valuations, property management, so full end-to-end. But the crux of what I do is just find a really good investment that's going to have good cash flow, good capital growth, and go from there.
Yeah, fantastic. And that really helps our viewers or listeners in this case that are looking to get into the property market and need that bit of research, because I find that with reading the books and doing different courses and learning more about commercial, I think unless you do it every single day, it's hard to keep on top of the changing trends, especially with the due diligence and whatnot. So, yeah. Yeah,
it's just the other thing is it's so varied. Like people, it's not like residential where once you research a suburb and you find 3-bedroom house sell for this, 4-bedroom house sell for this, you might not even find a commercial in that suburb. So you almost got to look in a wider variety, and then the different types of assets. You've got industrial, you've got retail, and you've got like office space, and then there's a mix. Then there's special. You've got like car washes and cinemas and stuff like that. But even something as simple as a warehouse, which is 3 concrete tilt-up panels and a roller door, they change. Percentage of mezzanine to floor area, office space to floor area. What areas is it servicing? Is it like a distribution type business near an airport or a highway? Or is it a service-based business like a car mechanic or fabricator, wholesaler? So you've always got to understand the nuances, whereas residential, it's a lot easier to not stuff up. But because of the moving parts, like I said before, the steps in the process, there's more to do to make sure you don't burn yourself.
Yes, and for that extra legwork, let's talk a little bit about some of the benefits of that commercial property. And one of the biggest aspects is cash flow. Is that right?
Yep. So you get about 3 times the cash flow with a commercial. So literally, and the main thing is because the tenants pay all the outgoings. So when you buy a 6 or 7% yielding property, that's net. Residential, you buy a 5% gross yielding one. By the time you pay council rates, water rates, building insurance, maintenance, that erodes to like a 2% net yield. So we're getting 3 times as much. And if you know what you're doing, you buy well, you actually get the same capital growth. So you're getting same capital growth, 3 times the cash flow. Where's the catch? That's where most people are like, well, why did I? Which you've spoken about on the podcast. Lending is a bit of a different game. Yes. You can't get 90, 100% loans very easily. Most people are 80, 70%. But on paper, like for the same purchase price, you get a way better result. But people don't understand it, and there's myths about commercial, and there's just general fear as well.
Yeah, 100%. So talking about some of those myths, you just busted one then, is capital growth. Whenever you speak to somebody, it's always, well, commercial just doesn't have the growth. It's good yield, but it won't grow. Yeah. Do you want to kind of run me through why that's a myth?
Yeah. So the premise of that myth actually comes from things like office space. Like they won't grow the same as a house. But of course not. Doesn't have a land component. There's no scarcity. They can always build 20-story skyscrapers next door. A high-density off-the-plan apartment doesn't grow the same as a house. So it's kind of misconstrued there. Certain types of commercials aren't going to grow the same. So like a retail in a kind of a low socioeconomic area might not grow the same as in a good high foot traffic area. But something like a warehouse actually has the same capital growth as the residential market. And it has to. The way I bust this myth, one of the sort of sub-myths is commercials are more expensive than residential. That's why I don't buy commercial. How did commercial get more expensive with less capital growth?
Yes.
Shouldn't residential, if residential had 2 or 3% more capital growth, over 30 years, shouldn't it be more expensive than commercial? So they actually go on par. Like if you've got a $500,000 house next to a $500,000 warehouse and the $500,000 house goes to $1 million, people in that $1 million house are going to look at the commercial being like, why don't I buy that? It rents for 3 times as much. That's also why the myth comes about, because sometimes they happen out of cycle. Yeah. So when residential is performing really well, people go, see, I told you residential's better. They're not talking about the period where residential is not performing and going from there. But on average, they all have 5 to 6% capital growth with the residential, assuming there's a land component and fundamentals. Yes. So that's probably the main myth around capital growth.
Yeah, fair enough. And another one that comes up after the capital growth, it's vacancy. Yeah. And I think it's because people go out onto the main street, they walk around their town and they can see shops that have been for lease forever. Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk me through why vacancy isn't as big of a problem as what people think?
It is a problem if you don't know what you're doing. But it's also a problem if you don't know what you're doing in residential. So if you buy in a new greenfield estate where they've released 500 homes, vacancy rates shoot to like 7%. So you have like struggle with tenants, you don't get the same rent. The problem is a lot of people compare commercial for retail. So they'll look at retail and they'll look at the one shop in their area that sat there vacant for 2 years. They're not talking about the other ones next to it that have been tenanted for 20 years. So they're looking at that one. And retail is a bit higher risk than say industrial. So industrial at the moment, every capital city is sub 0.6% vacancy rates. So that's basically the same as residential.
100%.
So there's certain types, and then office space, most of the vacancies are like 15 to 20% because of COVID, obviously.
Yep.
But certain retail areas have zero vacancy. Like surprisingly, some regional towns, the main strip, there's no vacancy, or if there is a vacancy, it's 1 to 3 months. The difference is you actually get the tenant for longer periods. So where someone in residential will say, look, it's only 0.5% vacancy, I'll lose the tenant every year or two and have a week or two's vacancy. Commercial, you get the tenant for 5, 10, 15 years. So if you have 1 to 3 months, it's actually the same net result, if not better. So this is where the myth comes from. It's kind of understanding like what you're actually buying, and you can mitigate some of that risk anyway. Like if I'm buying something a street back from the main road, that of course has a higher vacancy rate than the main strip. And then understanding like for a retail strip, the first 2/3 towards the car parks have lower vacancy than the last third because people get bored and they don't walk to the end. So this is the hard part with commercial, is understanding the nuances and go from that. But certain types like industrial, if you don't know what you're doing, you can get some confidence in the data. You can say, okay, in this complex, this is how long they were vacant. Any ones that went vacant, here's an adjoining complex because it is just 3 concrete tilt-up panels and a roller door. Yes. But retail, it's all about foot traffic, road traffic, the gentrification of the area, what's going on. Are they building other kind of retail centers and things like that? So I know I'm rambling quite a lot, but that's
good.
That's with commercial. But that's where the myth comes from. Someone says, oh, I saw a shop that was vacant for 2 years. Cool. Don't buy that shop. Go buy in an area where the vacancies are really tight. Yes. And like that's why I buy a lot of like coastal properties, for instance, where it's on beachfront, where they can't price you out. There's only one coastline. Yes. You're in that strip. So the risk with that one is seasonal. So you got to look at how it affects over seasons. But yeah, I'm all about low reducing risk, getting as big a cash flow return as you can with as low risk as possible.
Yes, and I think that makes perfect sense. Now busting that myth and kind of going under the surface, it makes sense why vacancy isn't that much of an issue, especially sub 1% vacancy is fantastic. So in terms of getting started, so we're busted some of the myths. Someone's like, yes, I want to buy a commercial property. When you're looking at properties, is there a couple of main kind of things that you look at when you're assessing a property at a very high level?
Yeah, so it's normally assessing the client's risk and then what they're actually trying to achieve over that time frame. So like a younger person, we might actually take on a bit more risk because we want a high cash flow and we kind of want to build, and we can handle the long period. Whereas if they're say 65 years old, your focus is always having a tenant. So probably not as much yield. You might not chase that extra 1% yield. You get a bit less because that's what matches their criteria. But to answer your question, versatile premises with a really low vacancy rate are the non-negotiables for me. So what I mean by versatile is like a warehouse. If you lose your tenant, it can be a car mechanic, wholesaler, distributor, fabricator, storage. So that's the first one. And then if you obviously can, get as long a lease as possible. If you can get that property with the low vacancy rates and get a 5-year lease, for instance, cool, you've covered for 5 years. It's positively geared. It's building its own buffer, and it's versatile, and the vacancy rates are low. But low vacancy rates also means like high rental growth. Yeah. And high rental growth generally translates into capital growth. So ticking those fundamentals, no different to residential. Like residential fundamentals, it's like look at vacancy rates, look at days on market, look at population growth, what infrastructure spending is going in. So we kind of transcribe that to the business world of commercial. Yeah,
that makes sense. And I touching on the section there where you spoke about the versatility of the asset, it's the same for lending. So if you're buying a specialised asset, such as a childcare centre is a really good example, an abattoir is another one, butcher shops, they're harder to lend against and you can't access additional leverage. So it's really good that you're looking for those properties that aren't specialised, because not only are you flexible with a tenant, you're flexible with your funder, which is really important because we've had customers before in certain situations. They've gone with one major bank, rates have gone up. Now we want to move, but that property type is only acceptable to that lender. So they've introduced another kind of risk that might have been not foreseeable initially when they purchased the property. So by looking for those versatile assets, it really kind of mitigates the finance risk as well.
Yeah, but for your listeners, there's a reason why the banks are not lending to that in the same return, because there is a risk. I get people all the time, they're like, oh, childcare is a bulletproof. I can tell you lots of childcares actually fail. The problem with I find is people buy it on a much lower yield. So they'll buy something like a 4% net yield when I could get a warehouse for a 7% net yield. So unless that's going to grow by 3% more every single year, it's better off buying that. But then the other thing is it's a very one-dimensional asset.
Yes.
If you lose your tenant for a childcare centre, not many people want to take over a failing childcare centre. No. And you've just left with this weird fit out of kind of rooms and playgrounds and stuff like that, which is, again, the one-dimensional nature of it. But again, there's certain types, like if you buy a childcare that's a retail shop that has a shop front, that protects you because the banks are going to go, okay, this is a retail shop. It can be a hairdresser or a barber shop or a medical centre. It's got that versatility. And that's what it's about. It's about protecting you long term, because you will go through a new tenant. Like assuming you're going to live for another 30, 40 years, you are not going to have the same tenant. Things change, and like I don't buy many like petrol stations, for instance, because I don't think they're going to be that many of them in 20, 30 years time. And there's land contamination issues. So even though I can get a high yield on those, and a lot of people love the yield, like, oh, I get a 7, 8, 9% net yield. I go, yeah, but let's calculate that over 20 years where you might lose it. And then the 300 grand for contamination that we have to deal with. Yes. And again, banks don't like it for the exact same reason. So I keep it simple. Like, and people laugh when I say this, I buy boring assets. Yes. Ones that just perform and are always going to have a tenant, because that's how you sleep at night.
Yeah, well, and like you said, the boring assets, the one that perform over the long run. And petrol stations as well, it's not just the fixing the contamination, even entry into that asset. The banks are looking for reports to confirm that there hasn't been leaks and what is the contamination situation. And that's for any property that has a petrol pump attached. It's a 20, 30,000 on top up front before they'll even decide if they're going to lend on that asset.
And it doesn't mean not to buy. Like I've actually bought one recently, but it was actually attached to a Woolworths and a BWS. So we had the petrol, but all we did was literally we did the risk mitigation of, okay, how much is this actually going to cost us if we have to change over? And it ended up being about 250 grand. So we budgeted 350. Got an extra 1 or 2% net yield, and then that over the next 10 years, that'll pay for that. And we know fully well that we might have to transition that into something else, but because it's on a roundabout in a prime area, it still made sense. We're like, oh, cool, we're gonna make up that cost, but we know we're gonna have an exercise. I can't predict whether that's gonna be in 10 years time or 20 years time or never, but at least we've protected ourselves, and that's part of commercial. I personally wouldn't buy it because I buy commercial to have a passive lifestyle. I want the passive income without thinking about it and hassle. Other people try to do these value adds, but like personally, my best performing assets are the ones I've bought and done nothing to. Just the capital growth and cash flow have done their thing. People always try to get fancy, same as residential. Oh, I'll do a renovation, I'll do this. But the grand scheme of things, growth is what does the heavy lifting as well.
Yes, 100%. And that's the benefit with commercial, just coming back to the start of the chat, because we have the cash flow and the same capital growth, all in 10, 15, 20 years time, we're going to be in a much better position. But over that 10, 15, 20 years that we're paying down the loan, we still have massive cash flow. The amount in the offset accounts is building. And I find that when you run the numbers from a cash flow perspective and looking for that passive lifestyle, the properties tend to pay themselves off quicker because there is more income coming through.
One of the things that baffles clients when I show them, if you buy like say $1 million property and it has 3% rental increases, which is quite low, like you generally see about 5%. Yeah. Literally in 13 years, like a 6% yielding property, even with interest rates where they are now, will pay itself off in about 13, 14 years. And that's with no big assumptions. And at the end of that 13, 14 years, you've actually got about a $90,000 passive income.
Yes.
Like when you say that to someone, they're like, that's my income.
Yes.
And you're like, yeah, you can retire in 10 to 15 years. If you do extra contributions, you do an extra 20, 30 grand a year, that brings it down to like 9, 10 years. That's game changing. To get a 100K like ish passive income with residential, you need like a 12 mil portfolio.
Massive.
And it's a 20, 30 year plan. And I'm not trying to sell the get rich quick, but when you just pose it like that, have a very simple, buy a warehouse, let's pay it down in 10 to 15 years and then have a nice $80,000 to $100,000 passive income conservatively, that's powerful. If you want twice that, buy two of them and work at that. And again, there's risks involved, obviously. Like if you lose a tenant, you got to mitigate. Same with residential. But that's the game-changing one for me. Like when I bought my first commercial, I was just like, how am I getting like 30, 40 grand a year passive income from the get-go? I'm like, I'm missing something here. Like the residential is only costing me 30, 40 grand. So there's 80 grand difference. And that's sort of one of the risks when people say, oh yeah, residential's lower risk. I'm like, well, no, if I'm paying 40 grand out of my pocket in like 4 years time, I'm down 160 grand. Yes. The other one, I'm up 160 grand. So even if it went vacant, I can actually handle 2 or 3 years vacancy before I have to dip into my own pocket. So what's the risk? But again, people are very insular and just focus on kind of like year to year and they don't think big.
100%. And that's why when we run the numbers, we actually have a 30-year kind of cash flow forecast that we use. And in that, we factor in high vacancy with 3% increases, so lower than standard as well. And it's incredible to see on the commercial side with a good yielding asset property purchased properly, which we'll come back to is very important. You can see the cash building, but if we switch that over and we do it with residential and we throw all the outgoings in, then we can very quickly see that accumulated cash flow figure at the bottom is negative, and it's more negative, and it's more, and then you get to maybe around 15 years, 16-year mark, and then it starts to build itself back up. But that almost chains you, if you're looking for passive income, if you have an asset that is that heavily negatively geared, it's going to chain you to work for that time frame. And even afterwards, okay, maybe you do have some rental increases, maybe that's great. You've still had to put a decent amount of money into this property. Whereas with the commercial, with the cash flow coming back, even though it's paid itself off, we don't necessarily have to close the loan. Yeah. We can just keep that money in the offset and we have this massive buffer that if anything was to go wrong, if there's anything that we do have to take care of, we've mitigated that risk entirely, which I think is fantastic.
But like you said, it's the risk of holding the residential that's the hard part, because people want lifestyle. And I can tell you from my sales calls, like young people don't want to work 40 hours a week for the next 20, 30 years. They want some form of lifestyle. It's locking you into that. And I'm not against residential. Like I personally own quite a lot of residential and I've done really well. And it's a great tool for leverage. Like if you're starting out, 100% go out and buy loans on 90%, 100% loans with parental guarantors while you're low risk and have the capital growth, as opposed to going out and buying like an 80% loan for a commercial. I'd rather have 3 times the portfolio. And if I get the same capital growth, make 3 times as much, because that's going to give me options. I can then get into a commercial and kind of schedule it. So residential's got a place, but in regards to lifestyle and risk, I actually argue commercial is actually lower, if you know what you're doing.
Yes. Well, let's talk about that a bit. So we're talking very much about commercial property, the cash flow. We talked a little bit about some of the key things you look at when buying a property. But why in commercial is due diligence so important, where with residential there's a lower level of due diligence? Why is there so much more for commercial?
With residential, because there's not much to do. Like assuming you buy in a good kind of blue chip suburb, you don't buy in a flood zone or a termite ridden house. Like you do a few checks like easements and stuff like that. And most people with residential, because they live in a house, they go, I get this. This is a nice area. cool. If they think it's a nice area,
Yes.
other people probably will. There's more to it than that. Like I'm a residential buyer's agent as well. And like I look at like days on market, affordability and all that type of stuff. So that you can get into the numbers, but you're less likely to burn yourself. Like if you go there and you look, okay, vacancy rate's 0.2%. I can handle the 20 grand a year negative. Next 20, 30 years, I should be okay. Commercial, because of all those moving parts, that's where it becomes hard. Like our due diligence report is like 80 to 100 pages long, which just blows people. And you've said this before. You've worked with other buyers agents and you're like, yours is just ridiculous, Steve. We go over everything like lease review, contract review, tenant interviews, foot and road traffic analysis, vacancy study, occupancy study. We check the leases registered. We check all the insurances. We do body corporate reports. We do competition analysis. And this is just me rambling like a handful of them. There's actually I've got about 100 things I need to check. And then just getting the documents. Like you got to get service contracts and stuff. Like we give a Dropbox with about 100 files and then we cross-check those against things. So there's just so much more work to do. But if you get it right, then it's very low risk. And like one of the risks we talked about before with like residential is maintenance. Like people forget like, oh, every 20 years I've got to do a kitchen and bathroom. You buy like a warehouse, it's some concrete tilt-up panels on a roller door. Like it's pretty simple. They come in, they put their pallets there and that's kind of it. But going through that process is quite a lot of work. Like average per property is about 20 to 30 hours minimum just to compile that report.
Okay.
So it's not just something like an armchair investor should be doing. Hence the whole purpose of my business is to kind of do that for people. But it's just cross-checking everything and you won't get everything perfect. And that's what scares a lot of people. Like we normally find a small red flag here and then. It might be like the mezzanine's not approved. So what do we do with that? Do we like go and get an approval? Do we get money off the price? Do we ask the seller to get it approved? Or the lease isn't registered? And that's what scares people a little bit because they have no idea. Like how do you get a lease registered? And they're like, I didn't even know you needed a lease registered. Like it's all that type of stuff. But I give all this information out. Like you can download my due diligence checklist on my website and that, but it's just a lot of steps. Like I mentioned before, it's just doing all that work.
Yeah. And you said it's 20, 30 hours. That's for your team that are trained and know what they're looking for.
That's a professional valuer and someone who's done 500 plus properties together, working together, doing it. And that's part of what I offer as a service is I'm somewhat of an insurance policy to make sure you don't make a mistake. I'm not saying I've got all the information out there. You can go do it yourself. 100%. But it's going to be that 1 in 10 where there is a red flag, what to actually do with it. And most people just get scared and don't commit.
100%. And the other issue is they could get frozen by wanting to overanalyze everything. So every single property that they look at, they're trying to go into too much detail about the wrong things and they end up never buying. And that time, it could cost them 100, 200 grand a year. Yeah. Depending on the asset.
Some people as well just don't understand what to actually do. So like something like residential, there's websites you can look at like what the market rent is for a 3-4 bedroom house. And you can actually go on realestate.com and see what stuff we're renting for. There's none of that for commercial. Like I need to go onto CoreLogic and even finding a comparable property is hard because something simple as a warehouse, like I said before, like what the office percentage is, what the mezzanine, how do I analyze that? And then you need to go look at like, okay, what rent did they actually achieve? How long were those on the market for? Were there any incentives? So there's a lot more grunt work with it, which people just don't understand. So that's probably the hardest part is there's no website you can just look up a vacancy rate. You need to go find comparable properties on like CoreLogic, talk to 2 or 3 property managers to find out what they got on the books because the market changes as well. And then something as simple as like residential, you might go, oh, look, it's getting $450 a week rent, but the market's $470. Cool. In 6 months' time, you're going to bump the rent up. Yes. If I buy a commercial and it's got a 5-year lease and it's 3% increases and it's below market rent, what do? Do I negotiate the price? Is that all right? Or what if it's over rented? Like, what do I do then? And how does the market reviews work? And there's all these layers that kind of complicate things a little bit.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. And I think as well, when we're talking about looking for assets to acquire, a lot of people jump on Real Commercial and start shopping around online, but they're not seeing the entirety of what's coming to market. Because I feel like a lot of the deals that we transact on and what we see is kind of off market or first look. So a lot of the good assets, and correct me if I'm wrong, you guys get to see them before they're hitting Real Commercial, and in a lot of cases probably transact on them before the general public see them anyway.
We see probably about 70% of what we buy is off market. I try not to sell that because I don't really care if the property's on market and it's a really good property, I'll still buy it. 100%. The benefit is I obviously get that, but I try to sell my knowledge more than kind of that side. But even ignoring that, it just like it's the agents are going to want to deal with this. And I know this is going to sound a little bit arrogant because we know the process and they know we're buying 10 to 15 a month. We know how it all kind of works. The problem with the commercial is because you actually have a due diligence clause on the contract, you can actually pull out penalty free, normally up to 21 days. So the agent doesn't want someone who's just going to pull out. They know we're going to get stuff sorted. If we find an issue, we'll get a price and renegotiate or get it fixed because we know what we're doing. Not just going to put. So it sounds bad. Actually, one of our recent employees came on. He's like, every property I put an offer on, the agent didn't get back to me. And I see on your system, you guys bought it. And I try not to sell it, but that's just the nature. Like I've done 1,500 deals now. Like the agents
fantastic.
know who we are and they send it to us first. And even if we've got the same offer as someone else, our offer does go to the top of the pile, which is nice.
That's always good. Yeah, well, I suppose it helps because you've got really good systems and processes, and a transaction from start to finish, everything's systemized. There's a process all the way through from the property when we're looking at it, inspecting it, doing the due diligence, but even post that, when we're doing the conveyancing side of things and getting ready for settlement, everything's very well structured. So I find that these transactions that are going through, they're all very smooth. It's very seamless. There's not really too much that the customer has to do. They can kind of do what they do best, continue making their money, and in the background know that, you know, you've done the due diligence on the property, everything's running smoothly, and the whole operation just works so good from a customer.
From your point of view, one of the other reasons they love us is because finance is in order.
Yes.
Like one of the biggest pet peeve of agents is most people will go to their residential broker and not have any idea, and they'll get told a number like, oh, I can borrow $1 million, and they think they can go buy $1 million commercial. And that's why, like, we've worked together 100 times or something now.
Yes.
They know finance is not going to be a problem because I've got an in-house valuer. You guys know what you're doing. That's going to tick over really nicely. So like that's probably the biggest one. They know we're going to satisfy due diligence and finance is going to be a problem.
Yes.
And I've also vetted them as well. Like I'm not going to buy a property for a client where they haven't spoken to a kind of reputable broker because I'm wasting my time. Like I don't want to spend and pay my staff 20, 30 hours of due diligence. And on average, it takes 200, 300 hours per client to find a property collectively with all my agents. So why would I spend all that and then not have finance in order?
100%.
So that's why I only deal with like reputable commercial brokers.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I know with the finance as well, it can vary so much property to property. And I think there are a lot of myths out there. And if it's not structured correctly, it can be trickier to put through. It's not impossible, but it can definitely be harder. And I find that especially looking at a lot of deals that have been done and we're now trying to refinance, restructure and get them ready for the next property, because that's the other good thing about commercial as well, is we have our growth, we can tap into that, buy more, and we can just continue growing the portfolio if that's what the customer's looking to do. But a lot of the times, if the finance isn't chosen correctly and they've gone through a lender that might have a higher interest rate by 1 or 2%, but it was a much easier process, but it wasn't really required, they could be missing out on a decent amount of cash flow. So I think by us coming through and structuring it correctly, it's a bit more work up front, but we get a better rate and the cash flow for the customer in the long run is a lot better.
Yeah, it does baffle me when people like say, oh, I'm with NAB, I'm just going to stick with them. And I'm just like, why are you not speaking to a broker?
Yes.
Like you might be saving $10,000, $20,000 a year, but more importantly for me is the structure that you mentioned.
Yes.
Like having the wrong structure or the wrong type of loan is what stops you from getting to the next one. And property is literally a game of finance. Like the whole reason I like property as a vehicle is people will come give me 100% loan with my equity. I don't have to use any of my money and I can keep kind of going. So I actually don't even care about property. I just like that the banks will lend me big sums of money so I can make big sums of money.
Yes.
You can also lose it if you don't know what you're doing. So I don't want to sugarcoat it. But why would you not speak to a broker? Like they don't charge anything. They get paid by the bank. You've on quite a few occasions actually told the person stay with their current bank. You're like, no, if that makes sense, stick with them. And then that's fine. That's good, reputable advice.
100%. And that's the thing as well. Then we have those instances where I had one reach out recently and we had a look. He's paying almost 9%. And we've moved him over to another major bank at 6.5%. So his cash flow has gone from really tight to a much, much better position. Set and forget facility, no annual reviews, because that's a big thing as well. We have the terms of the commercial property and the leases and whatnot, but then in the finance, it's not like residential set and forget. It's not a 30-year loan. There are 30-year products, like 30-year lease stocks and whatnot, but there can be annual reviews. There can be different stages where the bank's going to check in and make sure that your metrics are still the same and that the property's rented. And it's very important that when we're structuring the finance, that we are reviewing and checking that the terms and what the bank is offering is comparable to another offer, because the rates could be the same, the fees could be the same, but if this other major bank wants to check on you every 12 months and the other one doesn't really mind, then that could be a deciding factor because it's all time.
Yeah, it just baffles me when people get lazy. The thing I find is because it is a lot of work and a lot of headache to kind of change lenders and do the paperwork, and like someone like me with a big portfolio, like changing lenders is the biggest headache in the world. Like I'll spend 8 hours one night just going through documents, signing, things like that.
Yeah.
But if it saves me tens of thousands of dollars, if someone said, "Oh, Steve, can you come help like pack some shelves at the supermarket and I'll pay you 10 grand for the night's work?" You'd be like, okay, probably should do that.
Yeah.
But people just get lazy. They get too comfortable.
Yes.
And I've done it as well, where I've let it go like 6 to 12 months behind, and then you're like, well, I've just missed out on $25,000 worth of cash flow because I didn't refinance. So that's where a good broker is well. And I've seen you setting reminders as well. So every time it's coming up for renewal, call the client, see what other options there are.
Yeah, because we've got a post-settlement kind of workflow as well. So when a customer settles, we have check-in points, follow-ups, and we make sure they're ready for the annual review. But most of the time, and something that we're seeing more of now, is if it's less than $1 million, we can normally avoid the annual review process entirely and just run set and forget. Another product that we're seeing, and it's been a massive uptick probably in the last 12 months, is the SMSF, and people buying within, for the listeners that don't know, self-managed super fund to buy a commercial property. Have you seen an uptick in SMSF as well?
Yeah, so probably the last 3 years, about probably 30% of our deals are a self-managed super fund. It's just they basically achieve what most people want from their self-managed super fund, is an actual passive income. And as opposed to like a share fund, you get to leverage. So as long as you get that right. The main benefit, I don't want to give tax advice, but like,
of course,
there's huge tax incentives from extra contributions and with the positive cash flow as well, that commercial makes sense because you actually build. And most people from retirement, they don't want to have like net wealth in terms of like, oh, I've got 500 grand, let's start eroding that.
Yes.
They actually want the passive income. And then that also is an asset they can pass on to kids.
Yes.
And they also don't know how long they're going to live, etc. But the biggest one for self-managed super fund is there's just huge tax advantages, which is the main advantage.
100%. And I find the finance is relatively simple because self-managed super fund, when you hear that word, some people go, oh, it sounds complex, it sounds tricky. But the finance is really simple because the money comes in, we pay the loan, there's no living expenses. There's a couple of grand to maybe run the fund per year, and that's it. If it's net and positive, the lender will give you
the main headache I see from most clients is the setting of them up, because that is a long, drawn out, convoluted process, which it probably doesn't need to be. But again, if someone says you're going to have an extra $20,000, $30,000 passive income for the rest of your life if you just sit there for 3 hours and work with your accountant on getting this sorted. So, and if anyone needs recommendations, go to you or someone like me and ask who's good at setting these up, and we'll make recommendations.
Yeah, 100%. There's so many businesses that are specialised in that and have processes that are digital. We can just jump on and it's done, and it can be a lot easier than what it used to be.
The good thing with self-managed super fund is because you're doing extra contributions, it's effectively mitigating one of the risks as well, because like while you're still earning income, if you have a period of vacancy for 3 months, for instance, or even 6 months, it doesn't affect your lifestyle now because the money's still going in. It probably delays your large passive income by 6 months, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not hurting or taking away. But you've also got that pay down strategy as well. Like I mentioned before, if you start putting an extra 20, 30 grand into it, you can pay off commercials in sub 10 years easily. And then all of a sudden got a really good retirement. And then you can buy multiple. People go, oh, I don't want to have all my eggs in one basket. Cool, buy 2 or 3 $500,000 ones or $2 or $3 million ones, and have different assets in different locations, different types as well. Get a medical, get an industrial, get a retail, be in different industries and mitigate the risk that way.
100%. And in terms of getting started, so when we're talking about looking for the passive income, what is the best way for someone to get started in commercial property?
Get educated. That's the biggest thing I find is the clients, like, unless you get a client who just wholeheartedly trusts you, which is silly. Never trust anyone in real estate, not even me. Make sure you educate.
Yes.
Understand how it all works. So at least you can ask the right type of questions. And if you do decide to use a buyer's agent, they're not pulling the wool over your eyes. You're asking the right questions, like, oh, what is the vacancy rate? Where are the comparable sales? What do you ask the tenant? And then, like, we transcribe the conversations and things like that. It means you'll get more confidence in your decision. It's where most people fall over, especially when they go buy like an off-the-plan apartment or something. They're like, oh, it's great depreciation. Yeah, what are all the other stuff? So education is key. So there's other buyers agents and there's books and podcast series like this. So just get educated. Like it's going to pay its weight in gold long term.
100%. 100%. Yeah, you definitely have to have an understanding. You can't go into it blind.
It's the whole purpose of these conversations.
Exactly
This is why we do
right,
it, because people get it. Weirdly, I also get more business from the more information I give for free.
Yes.
Because it actually weirdly proves like competence, and people actually look at it like I mentioned before. I give my due diligence checklist away for free, and it's like 100 points on it. People look at that and go, okay, I'm not going to do all that. I'm just going to pay someone to do it, which is fine. But at least you can cross-check that I've done all that.
100%. And sometimes when I do have customers that, we want to give it a crack. Okay, fantastic. Look, there's some really good free resources. Jump onto the Palise Property website and you'll find them all there. You've got your checklist. You can do it all. And you're exactly right. They start looking at it and it's very much, okay, I'm not sure about some of these things. And they're not things you can Google. Like there's a lot of things that you can't just type into Google and find the answers for. So it makes it very easy for, them to have a look, get an understanding, know what the terms are, know what it means, but then have someone professional do the 20, 30 hours of due diligence.
Like I even give my book away for free. It's 300 pages and it's like a textbook. So you can actually go through and cross-check it. Like the information's there. But like I said, you need to understand it. Otherwise, like why are you trusting someone? Like no one else cares about your financial well-being as much as you do.
Yes.
Everyone is always trying to make $1 out of you somehow.
So if someone is looking for those resources, I did mention it before, but where are the best places to find that education that you have live?
Hopefully, I've got a podcast series. I've got a book as well. But even on my website, paliseproperty.com, there's like 20 spreadsheets you can download, all the checklists, things like that. I'm very active on YouTube and things like with educational podcasts and long form videos and stuff like that. So just start typing in commercial property investing. And like I said, there's other buyers agents, there's other resources. Read all of them, make an educated decision that way.
Yeah, 100%. No, I completely agree. Well, thanks for coming on today, Steve.
No,
it was really good to chat with you. And I think there's some really good information there. People who want to get started.
Thank you so much, mate. Pleasure.
That's okay, mate. Good to have you.